All right, y'all. I'm back with another video here. Today, I'm going to go through how to take measurements for use with MSO. It's been a little while since I've done a video, but if you kind of go back through some of the recent ones that I've posted, I think the last one that we did was about using Room EQ Wizard to take measurements in our room and kind of learn what things sound like and all that good stuff. What we're going to do is we're going to take that another step further and learn how to take measurements that we can use to import into MSO for the purposes of optimizing either our subs by themselves and then turning them over to our room correction software, or how to take the proper measurements to do a mains plus sub integration within MSO. Several people have asked to do a video or tutorial on that. You really have to do the measurements first and know how to take proper measurements before we can jump into that video. So I'm going to knock this one out and we'll get into it. We're going to do this in kind of three parts. The first part is going to be the overview, the introduction, and then how we get set up to take measurements. I'll do a second video on taking measurements for subs, and then I'll do a third video on measurements for subs plus mains. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So the target audience for this are the enthusiasts that are out there using the most common equipment. That's Room EQ Wizard, a USB microphone, and a mini DSP 2x4 HD. There's a lot of different equipment that's out there. This is what I use. This is what I think is the most common use case. Some folks might use a different microphone, like the Dayton UMM6. Some folks may have some more complicated setups with XLR mics and things like that. The concepts I'm presenting here are the same regardless of the specific equipment that you're using. I just can't cover everything, right? So we're going to go into this. I think the most important thing that we'll talk about today is going to be the requirements. That's why it's said 3 times and in bold along with the setup, because this is the devil in the details for this. Not sticking to the requirements is probably the single biggest reason for unexpected or poor results with multi-sub optimizer. You really do need to meet every single requirement in order to get good applicable results. And we're going to cover the most major, most common requirements only. This is a little bit different from the equipment. Again, depending on what you're doing, there are other requirements for less common configurations. I suggest reading there's an entire measurements section on the MSO website for details on some of those less common configs. Again, there are some considerations potentially if you're using Windows. I'm using macOS, but we're going to go through all these in general for the most common, highest level requirements from a config perspective. I think this slide right here is probably the most important one in the whole deck, in the whole presentation. We're going to go through this as an example, but I want to really make sure that if you take one thing away from it, it's this slide. All of your room correction, doesn't matter what room correction you're using. I'm using, Dirac. If you're using YPAO, Odyssey, Room Perfect, anything out there, it needs to be turned off. Once we turn off our room correction, we need to go into our AVR or processor, and we want to remove any delays, gains, polarity inversions, any filters that we might have. And we also need to do that in our mini DSP as well. I'll show you how to do that kind of stuff in this video, but we need to make sure that everything is removed. We recently helped out a user who had, if I remember correctly, he had turned everything off, but then had a delay set up on one of his channels that really ended up screwing with his results. And once we found out, hey, I've got this extra delay turned on one of his sub output channels, then we were able to get him good results. All of the measurements need to be time synchronized, which means we need to use an acoustic timing reference in Room EQ Wizard. That's one of the main reasons that we turn off all of our delays everywhere. Particularly when if you've done like a sub distance tweak, we're going to have that sub distance set to 0. All of our speakers are going to be set to zero delays. because again, those delays will mess up the timing of the measurements, and we want to make sure that we have that. And we're not going to alter the impulse responses. I don't think a lot of people do this, but sometimes when you're trying to compare and track down reflections, I know I personally will take the impulse response graph and I'll align things to try to figure out which reflections might be affecting multiple speakers. But we're not going to alter the impulse responses. That's a little bit more advanced, but just in case you've done that in the past, we're not going to do that. And then again, one of the most important things as well, and this just happened with someone else that Andy helped out on the AVS forum website, is when we export our measurements for use with MSO, they can have no smoothing applied to them at all. That applies to both sub measurements as well as the mains measurements when we get to the sub and the main sub and main integration video. Again, these are the most important things. There's going to be a few others that we'll talk about, but this is the critical thing to take away from this video. There are some general considerations as well. Again, there's two different types of measurements, two different types of work that we can do within subs. If we're doing subs only, we're going to energize only one sub at a time. And then it's important to note that if you have any subs that are on a Y splitter, which is common for folks that might have a single sub out on an AVR, or maybe you have just more subs than you have sub outs, and you've got a pair of them that are kind of co-located or very equidistant, running off of a Y splitter. Those are going to be measured at the same time, and they're going to be treated as a single sub from an MSO perspective. That gets into the application, where and how to apply, your resulting filters, delays, and gains for that channel. You're just going to apply it to the channel, not to the subs individually. I'm not going to go through that. I don't have that config in my room. I've got 4 sub outputs up on mini DSP and 4 subs in my room. But just be aware that if you are running a Y splitter, that's what's going to happen. When we do a subs integration with the center or subs integration with the mains, what we're going to do is measure each of those speakers. It'll be the center or the left and right together. We're going to measure them full range. So we're going to set them to full range in our processor. I'll show you where that's done. Again, that's part of the setup that we'll do. But then we're going to mute the subs because we want to make sure we get the full in-room frequency response of each of those speakers. For the center and mains portion, measuring for subs is exactly like sub only. We're going to measure one sub at a time, and then the same thing on the Y splitter. So this is another thing that kind of gets people, it can confuse people as well. Again, just this morning, there were comments on, how far apart do my measurements need to be and how many measurements do I need to take? The easiest way to do this is basically the number of speakers that you need to measure times the number of listening positions is the total number of measurements that you want to take. So I've got 4 examples here. I've got 2 sub-only examples and then 1 where we're integrating subs with the center channel. So if I have 3 subs and 2 listening positions, that's 6 total measurements. I'm going to measure sub 1, 2, and 3 at listening position A, and I'm going to measure subs 1, 2, and 3 at listening position B. We recently helped a guy out that had 8 subs and 6 listening positions, so that was 48 measurements that he needed to take. 8 subs, listening position 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. All right, pretty simple. If you're doing subs in the center, for a mains integration, you're going to basically need to add a measurement to each one of those positions. So it actually ends up being my subs and my center, which is 4 speakers times 2 listening positions. 2 listening positions is 8 measurements. Using that other guy's example, 8 subs plus a center times 6 positions is 54 total measurements. This next little bullet is another thing that kind of confuses people. What we really want is we only need 1 microphone position per listening position. Okay, so some people think, well, if one measurement's good, then more measurements are better, and that's not wrong. But it's also adds time consumed to take more measurements. Remember, if I have, in the example, I've got one guy here that might have 9 speakers. That's 9 speakers that I have to measure for every single additional measurement position that I take. It's also going to be additional time on, kind of letting MSO go run off and do its thing to do the optimization. So the minimum is going to be speakers times listening positions and that's the total number of measurements. I really recommend that, especially if you're getting started with MSO. Once you're comfortable with MSO, you could take more measurements, but it's really not going to buy you a whole lot of benefit. When we talk about the microphone position in each one of our listening positions, we want the microphone capsule. That's the thing that actually takes the measurement in the mic. We want that, which is on the U mic 1 and 2. That's the skinny end of the mic. We want that positioned directly between where the listener's ears would be, and then pointed straight up at the ceiling using our 90-degree calibration file that we've talked about in previous videos. Okay. So let's kind of walk through the setup. Again, it's pretty straightforward. We just want to make sure that we get everything turned off and disabled before we go running in and running off and taking measurements. Again, if you get the measurements wrong, the measurements are the really time-consuming part. But once you have a good set of measurements, you can, fiddle with all kinds of different optimization options in MSO. And the only time you really need to remeasure is if something significant changes in your room. Did you get new subs, additional subs, new speakers, different speakers? Did you add a bunch of room treatments to treat, bass traps, things of that nature? So, did you move your listening position? Did you switch from a reflective screen or something to an acoustically transparent screen? Those types of things that can affect our sound. That's the only time you would need to remeasure in your rooms. So let's go ahead and jump into the setup. So again, mentioned this earlier. This is going to take care of all of our prerequisites. We want to disable our room correction, zero out everything else that we might have in our AVR processor, and we want to clear out our mini DSP. So let's walk through what that looks like in my room. So my processor has a, oops, that window got moved a bit. Let me move that down. So my processor has a web interface. This is a JBL processor. I'm using an input that's called UHD. So if I go here, I can see that I'm set on the UHD input. And for each input, I have the ability to turn room correction, which is room EQ, on or off. I've actually already got it turned off. If room correction was on for me, this is what it would look like. So I just turned on room correction. This is just the name of my profile, my save slot in my processor. So I want to turn that off, make sure room EQ is off. It's going to be a little bit different if you have Odyssey or if you have a Yamaha processor. Now that the room correction is off, what I need to do is I want to make sure that all of my speaker distances and the levels, the gains, are set to 0. So I'll go to speaker distances. I'm going to set everything here to 0 meters. I think I can also do this. That's what my processor supports. Yours might actually have milliseconds instead of a distance here. But we're going to go through, we're going to set everything to 0. And sub is already 0. So there we go. That's all set. Those were old measurements. That's why there were some really weird, like 7 meter numbers in there and stuff like that. So I have all of my, that's all, I don't have to click save or anything. I have all of my channels now set to 0 delays. So now I need to go and I need to set my speaker levels to be 0 as well. These are some trims that I brought over from Dirac. I was fiddling with a few things, so I'm just going to go through and set all of these and make sure they're all set to 0. On my processor, it shows all channels available. Channels that aren't currently turned on or enabled are just set to gray. So there we go. We have everything set to 0 level as well on our gains. Now, in preparation or kind of, if we were doing just a sub-only integration, technically we wouldn't have to set everything to 0 on our mains or our other channels, and frankly we actually didn't even have to we didn't even have to fiddle with the surrounds because we're really only going to be concerned with either the center or the left and right pair. So I guess technically I could have set these to 0 and then set their distances to 0 and then left everything else alone because we're not fiddling with them. This is just habit on my end. Plus, when I turn Dirac back on my processor, it's going to override all this stuff and reset it to what I had or to what's in that Dirac measurement before I fiddled with it. But for sub only, you can set just the subs to 0 and the sub distance to 0, and that'll be the same impact. I'm going to use this one set of setting changes to do multiple videos, so that's why I just went ahead and set everything to 0, plus it's easy for me to get back. So the last thing that we want to do is on my in my processor, it's called speaker types, and this is where we enable channels on my processor. We want to make sure that the speakers are set that we care about are set to large. Out of habit, I'm going to set everything to large, rather than having any kind of a crossover in effect. When we go to measure our main speakers, we want to get the full range without the subs. So we want to see how low the speaker can really play in the room, because we can use MSO to help us figure out where we should be setting crossovers, and setting our delays to get things integrated properly. So we want to see that whole frequency range. We don't want something accidentally cut off below some arbitrary point that may not be the best for our room. So in my AVR, my processor, this is all I need to do. On my input, room EQ is turned off. On my speaker distances, everything is 0. My speaker levels, everything is 0. And my speaker types, all my crossovers are disabled, essentially. If I think I had these set to 60, and it'll automatically fill a few things in based off of that. But everything here, we're just going to disable. We're going to pretend that they're full range. Oops, yeah, too large, sorry. That they're full range and there's no crossovers in place, okay? The last thing that we need to do is, if we're currently using a mini DSP that might have some configs on it, is we need to make sure we get our configs out of our mini DSP as well. So I've already got the mini DSP plugin. I hate that they call it plugin. I want to call it the client software, but that it is what it is. So I've already got the mini DSP plugin loaded here, and you can see that it's connected to my mini DSP. So the easiest way to do this is probably to just go do a factory default. So what this is going to do, so one thing to make sure you know about the mini DSP is it does have 4 different configurations on it. So I'm going to do this on configuration 1. You only really need to do this on one configuration. Once you get things kind of set up and working well, the first config, you can actually back up that config and then load it on your other configs, or you can use these other configs for different configurations you might have. But the process is the same. We just want to make sure that we have the config that we care about selected. Then we're going to go up here to restore, and we're going to restore the current config only. And it says, hey, do you want to set this configuration back to the default settings? Everything on there is going to be lost. If you really want a quick way to get back, you can do a file save, and you can save the configuration file out, which is pretty cool. You can actually see I did that before the video to make sure I had a little backup here. So that's my my pre-video backup of my mini DSP, so I can put things back when I'm done. So you can save that, but then we'll go ahead and restore the current configuration, and we're going to say yes. It's going to go off and it's going to think for a minute while it does this. And what this is doing is it's setting it back to that default mini DSP config as it comes from the factory. We will need to make a few changes once this comes back in, and I'll kind of walk through those so you can kind of see what we're talking about. This takes a little bit longer than I think it should, but hey, it is what it is. Here we go. So now this config is set back. So I'm going to flip back and forth between some of my configurations so you can see what the differences are. So if I go to configuration 2, you'll see that my inputs and my outputs are named, right? So those are gone. The routing is different. It's gone back to the default routing over in config 1. And it's also changed the default crossover settings and channel linkage and all that kind of stuff. So what we'll want that was just to show you don't have to change off of config 1. So what I want to do is I want to get this back to where it's going to be easy for me to know what I'm doing. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to change the name there. I'm going to double check my PEQs, make sure that that's flat. That's great. And then I'm going to go to the outputs, and I'm going to rename my outputs. Let me double check the Let me double check the order of those because yeah, that's what I thought. Left front, left rear, right rear. So I'm going to go through and go ahead and name these just so I know what's going on. Oh, sorry about that. A little bit of a break. My son came up. Yeah, so let me get these renamed to the proper channels. This just helps me keep things straight in my brain. In case you're wondering what these things mean, it's a left front, left rear, right rear for the way I have my subs laid out. We can double check our PEQs. They're all empty, which is great. The thing that we are going to need to change, though, is the crossover, and we're going to need to change that on all four of our subs, or every sub that we've got. We're going to need to change the crossover, and the reason for that is that the mini DSP by default comes set up for doing active crossovers on two full range speakers with separate inputs. All we really need to do is bypass our crossovers, so it should be this darker gray and say bypass. So we're gonna do that for each channel. See, that's in there, and then bypass that guy. Crossover, bypass, and crossover, bypass. A lot of people will complain, hey, I ran a sweep and I'm not getting any sound out of my sub, and the mini DSP is in the default configuration and not allowing any low frequencies because it's got a low pass filter on it. So that should be it. You can check and see if everything's good to go, but it's going to be good to go. You notice our gains are zeroed out. Our delays are zeroed out. We checked our PEQs, they're zeroed out. Our crossovers are zeroed out. So now our mini DSP is in a state where it's ready for us to get full raw sweeps of our subwoofers, and then our processors set up that way as well, to do full raw sweeps of our subs and our mains. So what we're ready to do now is actually go take some measurements in mini DSP for our subs. We're gonna do subs first, walk through taking measurements there, and then we'll do measurements on subs and mains. Okay, thanks.